So can you just quickly introduce yourself and Max for the audience?
Yes, my name's Margaret Morris, and I'm the part author of Campaigning for Socialism, the memoirs of Max and Margaret Morris.
Yeah,
This book is quite unusual in that it's written by two people, but at a gap of 20 years between the first person writing and the second person writing. It's also unusual in that it is, in a way, two books in one. It's both a history of trade unionism regarding education, and it's a love story. And the two blend together at a real life love story.
yeah.
So that's why it's a very unusual book.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very kind of unusual setup there, isn't it? I mean, so was it kind of planned that way? Was it planned in a way that he wrote half of it, then you wrote half of it, and
No, that didn't happen. What happened was he wrote a historical section about the development of trade unionism in the teaching profession. Both of us are professional historians, and he wrote a very clear account of what the campaigns had been in the teaching profession. However, it was not published at the time because the publishers said it was a little lacking in human interest. And so it didn't get published when it was first written. But after Max died, I thought this is a tragedy that this is being lost. So I thought, how can I make it interesting so that it will have that human interest that the publishers originally said was lacking? So I thought, well, I'll just put in the story of our life together, because we did fall in love and we stayed in love and worked together for nearly 50 years.
Yeah, that's really nice.
Before we met, we were both of us actively engaged in politics. We didn't meet because of our political engagements. We met socially at a party. And then 2 or 3 years later, we realized that we had fallen in love and that we wanted to be together. The problem was that we were both married to somebody else, although both our marriages had gone stale. So that's why this is an unusual book, because the second part of it, the part that tells my story as well as his story, was only written in the last 10 years, whereas the other part was written 30 years ago.
Yeah, I mean that part that's really interesting, especially that kind of that change in time, that how the difference in time 30 years later, how the perspective must have changed since then, and also adding in that bit of human interest. I mean, how did Max kind of respond back then when like the publishers were telling him to add that sort of human interest element? I mean,
well, he asked me if I could find a way to make it interesting, but I couldn't easily do that in his lifetime.
Yeah.
Partly because in his last 5 years, he was very reliant on me as a carer, and I was too busy to write as well. And secondly, because he was very buttoned up about his private life and didn't really like talking about anything to do with his private life as against his public life.
Yeah.
And so it was easier for me, looking back, to do it without having to worry that he'd think this was really only to do with us. Things that were only to do with us. I didn't feel like that. I felt that our life together was interesting, and the way we handled our differences of opinion was interesting.
Yeah, I mean that you do discuss that in the book quite a bit. I mean, so is that, could you just expand on things like that? Like, like the leaving the Labour Party and things like that, and all the different policy changes over the years that kind of caused those splits of opinions and things.
Yes, well, first of all, we were both of us politically involved before we ever met, and in different ways. He joined the Communist Party when he was a young man, and still was in the Communist Party when I met him, although by then he wasn't really active in it. I had joined the Labour Party at the time of the Suez War and had become an active constituency member. Indeed, I became an officer in the constituency, which was Hampstead. And so I was in the Labour Party when we met and already fully occupied in politics.
Yeah.
And there was this quite big age gap. When we met, he was already in his 40s and a leading member of the trade union movement and a character on TV even.
Yeah.
Whereas I was nothing particular, just a very committed person to try and do something to help improve life in Britain. Max grew up in the Gorbals in Glasgow. So he grew up very aware of poverty, very, very aware of poverty.
Yeah, that's like
children not having clothing, proper clothing in winter and so on. What I was very aware of in my childhood, he was a child in the First World War. I was a child in the Second World War. And what I was very, very aware of was the horribleness of war, the tragedies it caused, the personal hardship it caused. My father and my uncles on my mother's side had all fought in the First World War. And in the Second World War, my father was involved in being an air raid warden in London during the worst of the bombing.
Yeah.
But also in the Second World War, there was the newsreels at the local cinema. And so we had every opportunity to know exactly what war was like, what it was, how horrible it was, and how inhuman it was. And I suppose that now the young people today are seeing again that because of the Gaza situation.
Israel, Palestine. I mean, that's the thing, really. I mean, even when Max only kind of briefly talks about like his childhood and things like that, it's just you realize how kind of resonant it is today. Even it's hard to believe that was so long ago, but it's still relevant today just as much, I'd say. So, yeah.
I think it's very relevant today, and it's very important to understand the way in which Britain changed from making progress towards a more fair and just society, a socialist society, and a society that's totally dominated by the interests of the people who own the wealth, which is what has happened to Britain today.
Yeah,
and
I mean, it must have been so.
Our book covers how all this happened. And I think, well, the people who've read it so far have all found it very relevant to our life today.
Definitely.
And I suppose why we had a different vision at first was because of the age gap. But yet we were both children who grew up in a war. Max in the First World War, me in the Second World War. And so our ideas were always governed by the fact that we must make life better, that after the 2 world wars, life was to be better for the people who'd had to fight for them, and also that it would be more democratic and more fair in the way it was organized. So we were both very committed as young people to trying to play a part in bringing about political change. And neither of us really ever changed, except I got a bit cynical about party politics and how they were sort of not necessarily fully democratic when you only have two parties. And all you do is you spend your time fighting inner party struggles, in really fighting to change the world, which is what both Max and I wanted to do long ago.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm now 93 and I can't do much more, but I thought that writing the memoirs would be a contribution to the understanding of younger people today in how Britain had become the country it is today. A country, alas, with 250,000 people living in destitution, in poverty, without the basic needs of life. That is something that I think both Max and I would never have imagined could be the case when we were nearing retirement.
Yeah.
Both of us were horrified at Tony Blair and the Iraq War. That seemed to be a terrible misjudgment.
Yeah, definitely.
Something that was wrong, fundamentally wrong.
Well, it was a complete betrayal of the kind of party line, wasn't it? But also, it's just like, I feel like there was so much progress across like the last century, but also just so much stagnation, and then that leads to the situation we're in now, doesn't it? In a lot of ways. But you know, I mean, what I mean, obviously, this is kind of the whole point of the book, and you know, it's a big topic to cover here. But you know, I mean, what would you say briefly are like the main things we can do to still kind of improve the situation, and like with housing and education and you know poverty and things like that?
We do have to rethink about the use of money because we've been tied for years to the idea of limited money and austerity.
Yeah.
What we don't want is more austerity.
No, definitely.
We have to find a way to finance the country to prevent poverty anymore. I find Max was very sad by the time he died that there were children living in poverty in England. 100 years almost since the Labour Party said the aim of the Labour Party was to provide education for all children, regardless of their class. That instead of education being divided so that the rich went to one sort of school, had one sort of opportunity, and the poor got very little education. We had hoped that by the end of our lives, things would have been very, very different. Instead, we've still got poverty. We've still got total inequality between the way of life of the people who own money and the way of life of the people who work. One of the best things in my mind that is happening recently is the resurgence of the trade union movement.
That's true.
And
a lot of people
what is also good about that is that when Sidney Webb wrote his original study of what socialism meant, he talked about workers by hand and brain. But over the years, it became that the idea of a worker was a manual worker. But now we're again where workers by hand and brain are realizing that they need to assert their rights and to get a fairer share of the economy devoted to looking after the population as a whole, not just allowing the rich to be very, very rich.
Yeah, it's maddening, isn't it? Sometimes just the situation, but
well, it's appalling.
Yeah.
It's appalling. This latest thing about the lady who got the money for making clothes during the COVID. I mean, it's just ridiculous. The amounts of money that were poured out of the public finances for this one little group of people to make a big profit.
Yeah.
And those sort of things have got to stop. And it will have to depend on the younger people now.
Yeah,
the younger population are going to have to change things. Of course, Max's age and my age, we tried hard to do it. Now it will have to be changed.
Yeah.
First of all, we need to get rid of the two-party system. You cannot change things when all you've got is two parties. And that's a problem in America as well as in Britain. But when you have democracy, you need a system where everybody feels that they have a chance to influence events.
Yeah. I
So
mean, no one really likes having to like strategically vote, do they? It's just like you just feel forced to either pick one or the other, but really there should be a lot of options for anyone.
Well, a lot of people have stopped voting because they can't really feel
they feel powerless,
that their ideas and their wishes are represented by the people who are elected.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, let's hope it's a bit better in the future, I think. But yeah, I mean, I suppose just to finish off, really, I've got a few more minutes left, but I just wanted to like talk about like as a light-hearted little coder. I mean, you mentioned like you and Max, you met like after, you know, in a completely different context of politics, but you just realized that you had the same kind of politics. But for anyone else who's like kind of looking for love, anyone who's like looking for people with the same kind of views as them, you know, do you have any advice for that? Any kind of insight into that?
Well, some things are now developing at local level with the development of the local mayors. Andy Burnham is leading the way, I think, to involving more people in having an influence on what happens in their own locality.
Yeah.
That is really the way forward. The trade unions and the Labour Party need to be supported, but as well as that, we need new visions. The whole question of the Green Party. This will be the future, really, that we have to have a wider democracy, a real democracy, where everybody feels like they can find a group of people to work with and to develop their own locality. The great harms that Margaret Thatcher did was getting rid of local authorities, the independence of local authorities, and then, of course, selling off the council houses. That was one of the great mistakes that she made. And now things have just got to be remade. The concept of socialism needs to be rethought, and the link with Stalinism needs to be forgotten.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Because that has handicapped the development of socialism. But it's a new period now. The young people today, and the older people too, like myself, who still care about our country and how it is governed, we need to assert ourselves. And that is the future, I hope. I shan't be here to see it, as I'm already 93. But in the next 10 years, things will need to change.
Yeah.
Very drastically. And we can't keep on just doing things in a way that suit the people who own the money. We need
Very
to
well
look
said.
after the whole population.
We do need to assert ourselves, but yeah, well said. I agree. All right, shall we end it there? I think
Yes, I'm still as left wing now as I was when I was young.
Yeah.
And so was Max when he died, but he died very, very disappointed. And so
it's
did
good that
I.
you got that conviction still, you know, that's really inspiring, I think, for a lot of people. So
Yes.
yeah.
He cared about children. His whole life was dedicated to the idea of children having good experiences at school, enjoying learning, having a wide opportunity to learn all types of things. All the things he cared about had not been achieved. And the horrible things that have been happening to the teachers recently, it's really, it's almost a good thing he's not here to see it, because he'd be so distressed about the way in which children are tested and tested and tested until they don't know whether they're coming or going.
Yeah.
And also how those who are slower learners are made to feel impotent and unimportant and failures, instead of being helped to learn in their own way.
Yeah.
So that is how it is, isn't it now? We've got to really start again, back where we were at the end of the two world wars.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's that whole thing of you know, you can't teach a fish to climb a tree sort of thing, isn't it? You know, each like kids need a sort of kind of a structured education, don't they? That's built to them.
Education needs to be tailored to the children,
not
the children to education.
100%.
That's what Matt to say.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that the book kind of gets a good audience. I think it really could, with a lot of young people today, and hopefully that kind of helps to inspire people to, you know, continue the kind of fight for change. Really.